let me paint you a picture. A grand charity event in London, cameras rolling, guests in designer suits sipping champagne, and music floating gently through the air. King Charles, dressed in his signature tailored navy suit, stood near the main counter, a symbolic station set up to serve soup for underprivileged children, a photo op for goodwill. Beside him was Camilla, queen consort, polished and poised in a pale blue dress. To the public eye, they were a royal dream team. But Princess Anne wasn't buying the act. From her seat at the far side of the hall, she was watching closely. Her expression calm, but behind those sharp eyes, every gesture, every glance, every word was being recorded in her mind like evidence. Camilla leaned in toward Charles, smiling sweetly, but the words that followed were anything but "You do it. They'll like it better." It sounded like encouragement, but Anne heard the command underneath it. The way Charles flinched slightly, the way he hesitated like a man who had to check for approval. Then, without a word, Charles took the ladle and stepped forward, not as king, but as a servant. Applause erupted. Cameras flashed. Except Anne. To the outside world, it was a charming moment. To Anne, it was another sign that something was very, very wrong. She'd seen it before. A week earlier at Buckingham Palace, she'd stood behind a tall gilded pillar during a formal diplomatic meeting between King Charles and the Swedish royal family. The atmosphere had been warm, dignified. Until Camilla barged in. No greetings, no protocol, just a sharp slap on the king's shoulder and a cold command, "Come on, Charles. That's enough." The room froze. Charles didn't argue. He simply obeyed, head down, walking off like a man who'd lost the ability to say no. Anne had felt something twist inside her. Her brother, once bold, strong, the future of the monarchy, was now being treated like a misbehaving child. And Camilla wasn't hiding it anymore. Her influence had gone from whispers to open control. That night, Anne couldn't sleep. She sat in her dimly lit room at Kensington Palace, moonlight streaking through the curtains. An old notebook lay on her desk, its pages filled with handwritten observations. She flipped through it, moments where Charles had seemed off, decisions that bore Camilla's fingerprints, meetings where her sister-in-law spoke more than the king himself. It was no longer just a hunch, it was a pattern. The real shock came days later, when Anne's most trusted aide placed a thick envelope in her hands. It was sealed tightly, marked simply for Princess Anne only. Inside, a report. Not rumors, not theories. Cold, hard evidence. Anne sat by candlelight and read. Camilla's sister, Annabelle, had been attending high-level palace meetings without any official role. She'd been giving input on royal finances, she had her hands in palace renovation funds, and Camilla's daughter, Laura, had appeared at private royal dinners, occupying spots meant for direct Windsor lineage. Then came the financial records. Millions, over $25 million of royal funds had been funneled to expand Camilla's private residence in Wiltshire. Contracts, land acquisitions, even artwork from the royal collection had been loaned out to decorate her estate. Not a single piece had gone to a museum or public gallery. No, these priceless items now adorned Camilla's personal home like trinkets, and gritted her teeth. This wasn't ambition anymore. This was invasion. She whispered her mother's words aloud, words Queen Elizabeth had once spoken to her in private. "Protect your brother. The crown isn't just power. It's a duty to history." Anne's resolve hardened. The line had been crossed. The next step wouldn't be quiet, it would be war. Buckingham Palace was unusually quiet that morning, the kind of silence that doesn't soothe, it suffocates. Princess Anne walked through the east corridor, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. Every painting she passed, portraits of kings and queens long gone, felt like silent witnesses to what she was about to do. She wasn't carrying a ceremonial letter or a polite invitation, she was carrying ammunition. In her hand was the dossier, a weapon made not of bullets but bank statements, transcripts, photographs, and signatures, every page dripping with evidence that Queen Camilla had gone beyond royal privilege and stepped into dangerous territory. Influence was one thing, this was domination. And now Anne had a plan. She couldn't act alone. One misstep and she'd be branded paranoid, disloyal, even treacherous. The monarchy didn't like conflict. It buried it under smiles and protocol. But Anne knew who to trust. That night, she summoned Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh. Sophie's reputation was as clean as Buckingham's marble floors, calm, collected, no scandals, no whispers, just quiet loyalty and strength. She'd been close to the late queen and carried a kind of moral authority no one could easily dismiss. Anne didn't waste time. She placed the dossier in front of her. Sophie read it silently, page after page, her face unreadable, but when she finally looked up, her voice was steady. "We'll need more than evidence. We'll need her to convict herself, on record, in front of the right people." So they built a trap. A charity planning meeting, innocent on the surface, official enough to include senior advisors, protocol officers, and a secretary from the Privy Council. Anne stayed in the shadows. Sophie would lead. Camilla, as always, would walk in, assuming she controlled the room. The stage was set in a small but grand meeting room deep inside the West Wing. Sunlight filtered through tall windows draped in velvet. Tea was served. White roses in a porcelain vase concealed a discreet recording device. Everyone played their role. Camilla entered last, dressed to perfection. Emerald green dress, jewelry sparkling, that familiar smug air like she knew the crown was already hers. She greeted the room with polite indifference, barely acknowledging Sophie's warm welcome. Talk began with guest lists, schedules, budgets, routine things. Then Sophie brought up the king's speech. "We've prepared a draft," she said gently. "Would you like to add anything before he reviews it?" The bait was perfect. Camilla didn't hesitate. "I'll decide. He'll speak as I tell him." She said it casually, as if it was the most natural thing in the world, as if she was the monarch, not the consort. The room went still. The protocol officers kept writing, but their pens trembled. The Privy Council secretary kept his face neutral, but his eyes flicked to the recording vase for a split second. It was done in a hidden side room. Anne listened through a pair of headphones. She closed her eyes, barely breathing. That one sentence had just handed her everything. 2 days later, she called for a private emergency session of the Privy Council. Only a few knew what was about to happen. Charles was told it was a matter of protocol. When he arrived, he looked tired, not physically, something deeper. The room was dark paneled, lined with portraits of monarchs who had once ruled empires. Charles sat at the head of the table. Anne stood with the dossier in one hand and a remote in the other. She hit play. Camilla's voice rang out, cold and unmistakable. "I'll decide. He'll speak as I tell him." The room didn't explode, it just froze. Every eye locked on Charles. Every breath held, and for the first time in a long time, the king didn't look confused, he looked ashamed. The verdict came quietly, without ceremony, but its weight could be felt in every corner of Buckingham Palace. The Privy Council voted unanimously. Camilla would no longer attend strategic royal meetings. Any expenditure involving royal funds now required approval by both the king and an independent oversight board. And every future public appearance made by the queen consort would be accompanied by a senior council representative. No statement was released to the press. The royal website issued a dry announcement about internal realignments to promote transparency, but inside palace walls, everyone knew exactly what had happened. The whispers were loud. Servants, guards, aides. They spoke softly behind closed doors, but the tone had changed. Camilla's presence no longer drew reverent nods. It drew silence. King Charles, once seemingly dazed and directionless, began to shift. At the annual Veterans Memorial, he stood taller than he had in months. His voice during the speech rang with clarity, not hesitation. He made eye contact with the crowd, his words landing with the kind of authority that made people sit straighter. There was no glance toward Camilla, no silent waiting for permission, just the king finally speaking as the monarch. At a hospital charity event days later, Charles bent to speak with children, shook hands with nurses, cracked gentle jokes. The stiffness was gone. He looked alive, in control, a leader again. The cameras noticed, the public noticed, so did the press. Articles began to circulate. The king's new confidence. Is Charles stepping out of the shadows? Nothing direct, but the message was clear. The fog had lifted. Camilla, however, still stood by his side, but everything was different. The subtle cues were gone. No more whispering in his ear, no more commanding glances. At a diplomatic reception, she smiled for the cameras, posed as expected, but the spark was gone from her eyes. The council representative, a sharp-eyed woman in a dark gray suit, stayed close, always watching, always listening. Camilla's leash wasn't visible, but it was tight. At a private dinner hosted at Clarence's house, the whole family gathered. Candlelight flickered on crystal and silver. The mood was warmer than it had been in months. Light laughter, memories shared. Camilla sat quietly, her usual charm muted. Across the table, Princess Anne wore a deep red dress, posture perfect, but expression calm. She had no reason to gloat. She didn't need to. When the meal ended, Charles leaned toward Anne. His voice was soft. "You did what I couldn't. Thank you." It wasn't just gratitude. It was an apology, an acknowledgement that he had been trapped, silently ruled by someone who didn't wear the crown. Anne met his gaze, eyes steady. She placed a hand gently over his. "No one humiliates the king, not while I'm breathing." They shared a brief embrace, and in that moment, all the pain, all the silence, all the years of pretending dissolved. It was a moment not of royalty, but of family. Camilla said nothing. She held her wine glass a little too tightly, her smile frozen in place. She knew this new reality wasn't temporary. The palace wasn't hers to command anymore. Her influence had reached its ceiling, and Anne had built it herself. By the window, Anne later stood alone, gazing out at the city skyline. Lights twinkled across the Thames, the hum of London quiet in the distance. Her mother's ring glinted faintly on her finger. Queen Elizabeth had once whispered, "The crown is a duty to protect, not a prize to possess," and Anne had done exactly that. Not with a sword, not with titles, but with silence, strategy, and the unshakable will of a Windsor.